Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And our extra special guest this week is Claire Fox, director of the Academy of Ideas and an independent peer in the House of Lords.
Great to be here on this podcast that I watch and have never been on before.
It's absolutely brilliant to have you. Thanks so much for coming on. We've got loads to talk about today, from the fall of the Assad dynasty in Syria to the United Healthcare CEO's killing, the Daniel Penny trial, and finally we'll talk about the rise of Reform UK. Before we get into that, I just wanted to let everyone know at home that we have a really extra special live event coming up, our last live event for the year. Brendan O'Neill will be joined by the brilliant James Dreyfus, hilarious comedian, star of Absolutely Fabulous, Gimme, 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 The Thin Blue Line. You do not want to miss this. So this is happening on Wednesday, the 18th of December at 7 p.m, and it will be on Zoom. It's exclusive for Spiked supporters, free for Spiked supporters as well. So if you're a supporter, do sign up to that now. If you're not a supporter, Tom, why don't you let people know how they can become one and the deal that we have for new supporters?
Absolutely. So it's, as people will have heard if they've listened to the podcast in recent weeks, we are in the middle of our Christmas appeal, our Christmas give-a-thon, as we've branded it very memorably this year, where we're asking people to donate to fund our work going into the new year. So anything you can give is hugely appreciated. We do have this special offer on at the moment, as you say, that anyone who donates £50 or more over the Christmas period will get their hands first and foremost on one of these free limited edition exclusive Spike mugs, but also you'll get a year's membership to Spike supporters, which will allow you to come to the Brendan event that we've been talking about, as well as other events and other perks that they can enjoy over the course of the year. I should also say, I just want to give a shout out to some people who have given some very generous donations in recent days. Gonzalo, thank you. Philip, Roshin, Hillary, Friedrich, Andrew, Robin, Paul, Dan, just a smattering of the people who have given very generously in recent days. We really appreciate it, and please do, if you haven't donated already, give to the Christmas Give-a-thon and fund our work as we go into the new year.
Thank you so much. And to do that, you can go to spiked-online.com/donate. We had 13 years of civil war, 50 years of the Assad dynasty, and then all of a sudden at the weekend, Bashar al-Assad is fleeing. It's over for the brutal dictator. Claire, what have you made of this? This is something that really has shocked the world.
Well, it shocked the world. Of course, I had no anticipation that that collapse would happen quite so quickly, because you imagine Assad there forever. And in some ways, it's the permanence of the terror that is inflicted on his own people. That was a demoralising and depressing part of the story, because there have been rebellions, there have been uprisings, and the place has been in chaos in some instances. And Assad, backed by Iran and Russia, has been able to really exert brutality on a scale that is unimaginable to us in the West. So you think, God, there's a rebellion. That's interesting. But we're going to see them really hammer down and clamp down on anyone who fights back. But they just, paper tiger. And of course, then you get a sense of, oh, yes, that's right. Hezbollah were their guys, and they've had a bit of a bad time recently. They've been humiliated by Israel. They've become completely a victim, an unintended victim, it might well be, of Hamas's attack on October the 7th.
Yeah.
And that pogrom that they led has actually now, coming as not a good thing for anyone who supported it. And basically, the fallout from it has been pretty harsh and good on the likes of Hezbollah. Iran has therefore got better things to think about. And of course, Russia in itself is preoccupied with the Ukraine war. So that's what's happened. Yeah. One thing that might be worth noting, I mean, there's more to say, of course. One thing that might be worth noting at this point is that it's one thing that we didn't know. It might be a slightly more nerve-wracking moment than none of the Western intelligence services knew.
Yeah.
Because we can say, oh yeah, Iran's had its eye elsewhere, Russia's been preoccupied. But I would have thought that somewhere in the West, there would still be people keeping their eye on what was happening in Syria. And they seem as surprised as I was. And the second thing is that as joy, I mean, you can't imagine how brilliant it would be for the people of that country to be free from this monster. And a dynasty, as you pointed out, not just the son of a monster, and it would carry on. And so that is over for them. Everyone can appreciate the celebrations and at the same time gulp, pause, and I think, those rebels, I don't want to now heroise them quite, because they are no doubt Islamist inspired rebels, and that's never quite a reassuring moment. So we'll see.
And I suppose we saw that's how things played out in the Arab Spring, for instance. And as you said, Claire, Assad was the one domino that didn't fall, which kind of shocked the world. Tom, there has been this concerted effort by HTS, the most powerful rebel group, both on their part to present themselves as moderate, but also the West is presenting them as moderate, talking up their moderation and lack of, Islamist ideals. What do you make of that?
Well, you do think there would be more pause than just accepting wholesale the sort of PR offensive that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and al-Jilani, the rebel leader himself, have really been going on in the past couple of days. On the one hand, it's clear that some sort of shift has taken place. Al-Jilani was originally kind of dispatched by al-Baghdadi, later the caliph of ISIS, to go and set up a jihadi franchise in Syria. He broke with Baghdadi. They then broke with al-Qaeda, and there is evidence they have that HTS have been fighting al-Qaeda affiliates and the remains of ISIS. So there clearly has been some sort of break. He clearly has been one of among a group, actually, of sort of jihadists who have embrace what some people have kind of called like a form of like jihadi nationalism, that the kind of transnational terrorism route has brought nothing but trouble for them, and therefore the aim is to kind of hunker down and build a state, as they have been doing in Idlib province, where HTS have been in charge, running a very repressive regime. It's worth noting. Everyone seems to be ignoring some of those details, but nevertheless very much focused on their own sort of patch of the world, if you like. But at the same time, the kind of willingness to just accept that therefore these are the kind of Islamists we can do business with, I find strange. I mean, obviously there's the realities of having to accept that things have changed, accept that these are people that that various countries are going to have to deal with in one shape or another. But the willingness to so quickly kind of accept that things are going to be so much different now, that the claims that have been made that minorities are going to be respected, that this isn't going to be a sectarian regime, the willfulness and the naivety and the willingness to accept all of that on the part of Western commentators, certainly I find at the very least unwise. And also it's something that could easily come back to bite them quite quickly, because that very kind of simplistic way of discussing not just this conflict, but various conflicts in that part of the world, where it is just a case of rebels versus evil dictators and so on, often misses some of the nuances and often creates a situation in which people have been complacent about new and emerging threats. Even though we can all celebrate, as we've all talked about, the fall of this brutal dictator, this is clear a moment still of tremendous potential peril for the people of Syria as much as anyone else.
It makes it sound almost like Star Wars rather than a real conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things which has been disconcerting is that it's one thing having a realpolitik approach, which you would expect. These are the new guys in town, and you can be pleased that Assad's gone. You want stability in the country for the people there, but also for the sake of stability in the Middle East and in the whole region. So then you think, that's one thing. Then you think, well, you're not going to kind of go out and attack them straight away. But I found it peculiar that we've had so many Western commentators almost doing their PR for them. Or, not just buying the PR, but then kind of talking them up. Saying, well, they seem to have very reasonable values. I mean, I would just like to say Afghanistan for a little moment, because, I at the beginning, after the retreat, the Great Western Retreat, the humiliation of the America fleeing and the UK, there was, we've got to bear in mind that the new rulers of Afghanistan have told us that they're going to be very nice to women, and they're going to be, well, tell that to the Afghan women. You can't tell anything to the Afghan women, of course, because they're not allowed to speak to you. They're not allowed to study. I mean, it's a horrendous situation there. And just as an aside, I was really glad to see the Women's Rights Network in the UK, all around the country, doing protests to draw attention to what was happening to Afghan women, because you can easily forget these things as sort of shared embarrassment by the West that they helped create it. But anyway, I'm making that point because I think you can have real politics and also not be completely conned or in fact sing the praises of a regime that you know very, very little about. And if they didn't know that the Assad regime is about to fall, then you can be damn sure the intelligence on all these different groups is pretty weak too. So I think you've at least got to be a bit more pragmatic. The only other thing that's been interesting, I don't know if you've been following this, but which is that there's elements of a kind of Stalinist left in the UK, and people who have been very much supporters of the defeat of Israel, who have actually been rather upset about the fall of Assad, because of course he was part of the pro-Iran, anti-Israel, kind of by default, because he was friends with Iran and Hezbollah was involved. They were kind of sympathetic, and they've been on in the other extreme, saying, "Oh, it's disgusting that you lot are all supporting the rise of Islamist terrorists." I mean, they've all been writing these columns. They're going to kill the Kurds, they're going to kill the women, and so on. And you think, what? So now you're being defensive of Assad as the best of a bad bunch. Yeah. I mean, what a disgusting reaction that's been from some people who call themselves progressive leftists, and it shows you where hatred of Israel can lead you into the most unsavory situation.
Hatred of Israel, and also just that kind of anti-Westernism that they have, because there's no rhyme or reason to it. In one situation, they support a dictator imposed against the Islamist threat, and in another situations like Hamas, they'll happily align themselves with a Islamist.
Well, they're trying to call out people like your double standards, you see, because they say you're anti-Islamist. Where are you now when the Islamists are coming to play? But like you've just rightly pointed out, it's they that have something to be accounted for here. And I agree, it's an anti-Western vibe.
And I know we have already talked about it, but the way in which this was precipitated by Israel's incredible achievements on the battlefield in terms of bringing down Hamas, but also taking out so much of Hezbollah, I mean, we often talk about that as if it's just Hassan Nasrallah and, the kind of leadership, which would be significant of itself. But that kind of whole leadership class really has been absolutely removed, so crucial to propping up the Assad regime. So the combination of that and, of course, Russia being bogged down in Ukraine and so on. But it is interesting because of the fact that forces like Hezbollah, because of the sort of Iranian designs in the region, you have had in the process of Israel just defending itself and its own sort of territorial integrity and its own citizens, it has dealt this tremendous blow to these movements which pose as kind of anti-imperial, but are really kind of executing the sort of imperial designs of Iran, really, who have
axis of resistance.
And precisely forces like Hezbollah, who by getting involved in the Syrian civil war, as it's often slightly simplistically called, actually opened themselves up, it seems like, to the infiltration by Mossad and so on, which laid the foundations for things like the pager offensive. So it's really been a tremendous blow, not just to these forces, these Islamist forces, Iran itself and so on, but also to that general sort of tendency to try and essentially not just govern your own territory or repress your own people, but to extend that, beyond into their near abroad.
But I think it's also, it is a sign of hope, or it's worth noting, and I hope it will be held up in this way, which is it can and must feel like an almost impossible situation if you live under one of these kind of brutal regimes, that it will always be there. I mean, I was thinking that if I was part of the Iranian women's resistance, where they take their scarves off and are brutalized and then thrown in jail, but incredible courage shown nonetheless, that I would take some heart from this, because these regimes look as though they're all powerful, but what they've got is the authority and the might, but they've got they've got the power and the might, but they've got no authority really. It's just paper thin. It's entirely dependent on brute force. And if something goes wrong with your military capability, then there's no one to defend you. You just collapse. So I'm hoping that what we've seen happen to Assad could be the start of a few places having implosions of a similar nature, which would be brilliant to see.
Definitely. Let's talk about the killing of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. He was shot in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan last week. Now, a suspect has been identified, Luigi Mangione. Tom, the online reaction to this, I think it's fair to say, has been insane on a number of levels. I think, first of all, we had the sort of wave of sympathy with the killing on the grounds that essentially the US healthcare system is decrepit, insurance companies are corrupt, all those kinds of things, which you might sympathise with those ideas, but not to the point of killing someone. And now that the suspect, his identity has emerged, we're seeing an almost fanboying of him.
No, absolutely. It kind of started with, it's been a strange mix of things, hasn't it? On the one hand, a kind of gallows humour, a kind of tongue-in-cheek celebration of this alleged killer as almost a sort of Robin Hood figure, and also seemingly people who are just quite attracted to him. It seems to be a mix of all of these things put together.
Like his six-pack or whatever.
Yeah, it's an odd one, but I think the thing that kind of connects it is just a profound sort of like moral confusion, really, about what has taken place here. I mean, the suspect Luigi Mangione, to the extent that we know much about him, it's that he wasn't any kind of hardcore leftist taking up arms by any stretch of the imagination. Seems to be someone who, broadly speaking, was quite into the kind of centrist podcast bro circuit, quite a bit socially conservative, quite into AI chat and gym tips, that kind of thing. Yeah. But seems to have become preoccupied with the healthcare issue, had back problems himself. The very short manifesto that they found on him when he was accosted at a McDonald's in Pennsylvania referred to the CEO seemingly as parasite, saying that something needed to be done. Wrote words on the shell casings of the bullets, which are words that routinely appear in kind of health insurance policy documents and so on. So he's been, I don't think it's unfair to say, kind of celebrated, and not just by, people with eggs as their avatars on Twitter, but from quite prominent, not necessarily like the organised American left, but the kind of streamers, the YouTubers, that whole kind of bubble that exists that talks endlessly about these topics and have alarmingly large audiences. I suppose the response from American conservatives has been to present this as a sort of mainstreaming or an apologising for a kind of revolutionary politics, a kind of rise in and support for political violence. I think it's something a bit stranger than that in some respects. I think there's a kind of celebration of this it's kind of an expression of a weird sort of cynicism almost. It's like, this might not achieve anything and it's quite gross, but at least it's landed some abstract blow against the man or whatever, even though what we're talking about here is a cold-blooded murder. But it's become a kind of real pop cultural moment. Yeah. As much as anything else. And that's something that I don't think many people saw coming when they first heard news about this particular killing. Yeah,
Claire, it does have that feel of, the left not able, or unfortunately hasn't succeeded in transforming the US healthcare system, can't really change society anymore, doesn't have that kind of power and influence. So reduced to taking a sort of vicarious thrill in certain quite tragic events, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom's right to say that it's not particularly the mainstream left. Mm-hmm. It's more of a vibe around this, which is, it's understandable because there is a hostility to corporate America. I mean, they're the bad guys, and health insurance is certainly one of the bad guys, which objectively we can all say, if you get sick in America and you aren't well off, is a horrible situation to be in. So I that can be, sorry about the pun here, but weaponized in such a way that it becomes, just as you say, the cultural vibe, which is, well, it's sort of understandable, which is disconcerting and unnerving. For me, there's something about, it is a strange case because this young man is obviously very disturbed. I think his back pain was slightly more than just back pain. I mean, I think he's been in agony. And what's more, his mother had a very debilitating pain problem. And I think and he was worried that he was going in the same direction. I mean, the kind of, a young woman, but has destroyed the quality of her life. And I'm sure there's all that. I sound like I'm doing a personal story, but you can see it's obviously messed him up in a big way. Yeah. But one of the things that's peculiar when you read the manifesto, because it's very slight, is you just have a sense of grievance culture, which is mainstream. It's not that he's left, but a sort of grievance culture. And also, there's nothing else that I can do but this. That nobody will listen to us. Nothing can be done. And I think that kind of nihilistic sense of despair is actually a bit more prevalent than one would think. It's not that people are going to go around killing people, but I do think that's weird, weirdly of the moment. And as I say, grievance culture does lead people into these quite dark, violent fantasies, which is that your enemy becomes somebody that needs to be taken out. And so I fear for that kind of vibe. I did want to, however, also back up, Tom, or what you said about what the right's response to this, which I think has been less than helpful, to say the least, because if you go around trying to suggest that this very disturbed alleged murderer is, it's just like Antifa. You know what I mean? He's like a commie, Antifa, militant lefty. You think, oh, that's as numpties, you know what I mean? Hopeless. Because that doesn't express what's happening and actually misses the moment. It's perfectly right to hold Antifa types accountable for the kind of violent interactions they've had on the streets, the way they want to compel speech on people. And, we all remember the Black Lives Matters moment and all of the rest of it. Their version of cancel culture is pretty vicious and physical. But that's not what this young man represents. And you don't want to be so crude as to just go, anyone who's not right-wing is part of some communist violent backlash. It doesn't help anyone understand the world.
Yeah.
And it almost kind of treats it as almost too political in a sense, because there always are, in a country that big with that many weapons, there are always probably going to be people whose personal or political grievances will turn violent at some kind of point. The difference is you don't want as a political culture to in any way justify or to give weight to that, and that seems to be what's sort of taking place. And I think because it feels of a piece with trends and discussions, particularly on the American left, that have been taking place over recent years, which even though these are different phenomena, the way in which, say, the Black Lives Matter riots were, despite also being a kind of form of mindless violence effectively, were justified, to some extent celebrated, presented as an understandable response to an unjust system. You feel that these things are kind of a piece, that because there is this climate in which people feel like the society, it's not just the society is on the wrong track, it needs to be changed, maybe even changed quite radically. It's that it's rotten, unchangeable, and so you might as well go out in a blaze of glory. That is something which is beginning to be more clearly articulated in those kinds of corners.
And you can imagine it. I mean, people don't do this as yet, but you can imagine a situation where this guy is a bit like a sort of school shooter. But, you're not in a situation where school shootings happen, these terrible events, and people go, well, it's understandable. There is discipline in the school and those teachers are quite authoritarian. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, but it's almost of a piece with that, what the way that people are accepting that what he did was understandable. I also think that we have to give some credit to the fact, we have to understand, I think, that nihilism is very dangerous. That kind of despair. He himself says, I do what I have to do. I'm very sorry in advance to anyone who might be upset. I thought you're not putting out an offensive post, right? You're going out with a gun to kill people. But he says, I have to. This is what we need to do. And that's the bit of desperation, which is apolitical, anti-political, that I do think, that's what I'm saying, is a vibe that I think is a bit more recognisable and worrying. And I do think as well that crass anti-corporate politics is, which we see all the time, anti-big pharma, anti-big bank, anti-big, you can do a sophisticated critique of corporate America without just everything that is bad being the responsibility of big corporate.
Yeah, definitely. There are so many reasons why you might want to be your own boss one day. Maybe you've got a great idea that you've been working on for a while. Maybe the winter work grind is just wearing you down. Maybe you just want some more freedom and flexibility in the next year. Well, if you're looking for a sign, here it is. That's the sound of a new sale on Shopify, the platform revolutionizing small businesses across the world. Whether you're selling gardening gear or homebrewed beer, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person so that you can focus on what matters, growing your business. Shopify is an all-in-one e-commerce platform that covers all of your sales channels, like critical social media marketplaces on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Shopify also comes with industry-leading tools that allow you to grow your brand without needing to learn any new skills in design or coding. One of my favorite things about Shopify is how simple it makes marketing. There's so many tools that can help you with your marketing campaigns without all of the usual hassle. And I really can't forget to mention Shopify's single-use dashboard. It means you can manage orders, shipping, and payments from wherever you are in the world. Now that's freedom. So it's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Another landmark case in New York of Daniel Penny. He was tried for killing Jordan Neely, a black homeless man on the subway. He restrained him because he looked as if he was about to attack other people. He was acting erratically and in a threatening manner. Penny was cleared, but I think the implication of the case, and I think certainly this was the view of the state of New York, the view of many activists, was that this was some sort of racial crime, that this was a modern day lynching almost, when clearly the jury disagrees that that was the case.
I know, and they've certainly tried and failed, it seems like, to present it in that way. I mean, it is worth saying that the case itself, it wasn't a hate crime that he was being tried for. This was all, any claims that this was really motivated by racism that was made purely on the basis of that the person on trial was white and the person who sadly lost their life was black. There was no other indications. And also, if you look at the footage from the horrendous incident itself, a lot of the other passengers on that particular subway car who were talking to the police and saying, I don't think he did anything wrong, or explaining just how erratic this individual, Jordan Neely, was being, running around saying, I'm ready to die, someone's going to die today. He was clearly off in the midst of a kind of some sort of mental health crisis and also high on drugs at the time. They were really painting a picture of them feeling very fearful and threatened, which, given the fact that there's a lot of these kinds of characters walking around the New York subway system, is probably saying something about how extreme his behaviour was in that particular instance. So I do feel like this is another case in which for lack of a better phrase, sort of the BLM style grift, simplistic narrative has kind of evaporated. And I mentioned BLM pointedly because the kind of New York BLM chapter have been very vocal in trying to present this as a clear-cut lynching, as you say, trying to suggest that by failing to convict Penny, that this was a win for the KKK and so on. This is a jury that was drawn from Manhattan. The idea that this is,
it's open season on black people.
All of this kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think there's a sense that the bubble, if it's not burst, it's certainly, you can't get away with those kinds of arguments anymore. And whilst this, it's no one wanted that particular interaction on that subway car to end the way that it did, not least of all the accused himself, who seemingly would rather this ended any other way than this. But that's completely different to say this was an unfortunate tragedy, a sort of accident, but one that is explicable and one that probably, if we're being honest, should never have ended up in a courtroom and wouldn't have if it wasn't for this quite politicized nature of these cases now. Yeah,
that's the thing, isn't it, Clay? It's the racialization of these issues, the politicization of what is a terrible tragedy, gets in the way of actually understanding what happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, AOC got involved in this quite early on, and I think it's something about the fact that Penny is a former Marine, kind of fits the caricatured model of what they imagine, a strong male ex-Marine white guy. That's everything about white privilege that you could possibly, versus a black, homeless, poor person. I mean, the story writes itself if you don't think about it for 2 minutes. But as you say, it's a different story, and I am glad that the narrative didn't work. I mean, it was carried on in the echo chamber that calls itself, modern identitarian anti-racism in America, and picked up, of course, by the European left to a certain extent as that being the story. But it didn't hold up in any way whatsoever. And I think that the bigger problem, which most Americans are aware of, is that they've got a real problem of psychotic homeless people off their heads, either on drugs or mentally ill. And poor healthcare. We've just been talking about that.
Yeah.
Very, very limited access to healthcare. Actually, there's another story which has always been the point that there's progressive mental health campaigners in the US calling for people to be allowed into the community to integrate in. Of course, guess what happens? It's not been all a successful story. And many people who travel on the subway system will have encountered those kind of scary moments. And if somebody feels like they're a threat to your life, and then some brave young man uses a chokehold, which ultimately was meant to restrain and never at all hurt or kill, then I think that it's very refreshing to have a situation where the real story comes out. People realize, it's a bit more complicated than that. So yes, a good result from a terrible tragedy that others try to racialize for the most venal reasons, for their own aggrandizement as these anti-racists. Terrible.
And it's a very grim situation where people only really care about a Jordan Neely at the point in which he tragically loses his life. There was a lot of failures that preceded that. Not only did he had a very hard start in life. His mother was murdered as a young man. He, was clearly had drug problems. He had all these mental health issues, all these health issues. He had a rap sheet as long as your arm. Was also clearly quite genuinely dangerous. One of his convictions was for assaulting a 60-something woman.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a very disturbed individual, very troubled individual, someone who a sensible system wouldn't, frankly, have been allowed out to roam the streets quite as much as he was. So it's because of the fact that you've got the failures of social services, the healthcare system, what have you, coupled with obviously the individual's own choices and their family and so on. And then also what's happened in New York and other democratic cities over recent years is a kind of withdrawal of the police to a large extent from a lot of places, which has left people to have to kind of fend for themselves, and in some respects, this is why I think this case has kind of become a kind of successor to the Carl Rittenhouse circus in a certain way. It's because you have a situation where people are almost feeling, rightly or wrongly, compelled to take matters into their own hands, because because order is sort of broken down on quite a basic level.
There's a message for us, isn't there, in this? Because I do think that increasingly people feel that they may have to have a sort of vigilanteist approach to protecting their loved ones and their families in this country because of the crisis in the police. And actually we are seeing many more people now who are very disturbed and ill wandering around some cities, and homelessness is spiraling out of control. And I mean, not the kind of homelessness that was just kind of statistical, but tent cities and so on. That's beginning to be a feature in this country. And just not enough, I don't mean not enough resources, but not enough thought and care put into how you deal with what is a very deep social problem. And then you will hear people saying, if anyone comes near me, I'm going to intervene. And or the other one is that people look away and then terrible things happen, which attacks happen because people haven't got the courage. But it does indicate that the state is not living up to its obligations, which is to, at the very minimum, to protect its citizens from those kind of incidents.
Yeah, definitely. So is Reform UK on the march? A shock poll last week showed them actually polling ahead of Labour, second after the Conservatives. There's also been a lot of defections to Reform. Major donors, the billionaire Nick Candy, who used to be a big Tory donor, has become their treasurer. There's even been talk of Elon Musk possibly injecting hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars into the Reform coffers. Claire, what do you think? Could this be Reform's moment?
I think that there is a momentum around Reform that's almost got nothing to do with Reform. If you actually talk to people that are now saying, I'm going to vote for Reform, or I think Reform, they are unfamiliar with any of the policies that Reform stand for. They've become symbolic of the huge disillusion with mainstream politics. And that, of course, is something to celebrate. And I think that Reform are reaping the benefit of the very rapid plummeting support for the Labour Party, which was already only in a situation of being voted for because the Tories were so despised because of their betrayal. So a sense of betrayal in general means that people don't want to just retreat into nothing, but want to find a way of expressing their populist discontent. And of course, Reform standing there, and you can then look to them. Farage is a very high-profile figure. I do think and so once the momentum's on your side, and therefore I do think some of these defections are significant. I actually think that it's amusing to watch Elon Musk trolling Keir Starmer by sort of promising to make Nigel Farage the Prime Minister through a massive donation in the way that he helped Donald Trump. I don't know how serious that is, but it's been amusing. But apart from anything else, you think, well, there is a gap between the Elon Musk, they're kind of saying how disgusting he dares intervene in. When you think Elon Musk argues for free speech, you are the Prime Minister that basically endorses and gives a green light to locking people up for what they post on social media. He's not one of your fans for obvious reasons, and there's a point to that. On the Farage moment, because there's been quite a lot of internal tensions in Reform as well.
Yeah.
We should, Ben Habib, as high profile as you can in those circumstances, kind of said, I'm no longer got anything to do with Reform. The internal democratisation is not happening. There was some tensions around a split over the way that they voted for the assisted dying bill, and whether that was indicative of anything in particular. There's still an ongoing rumbling of complaint about the young MP James Murdoch, I think, is that his name? Because it's revelations about the earlier crime for which he actually did serve his time, whether it involved more violence against women, and so there's a kind of nobody quite defending him. I know that they've been getting rid of and sorting out a lot of the old staffing, and that therefore means that there's slight discontent if you don't like who was got rid of. I mean, Gwaine Towler, at some point you should have on the podcast, but I mean, he is a man who knows where the bodies are buried, and he's been very loyal, but he's been sacked, and he was somebody who did have a comprehensive set of relations with journalists across the board that did some good for when it was the Brexit Party and Reform. So I just don't want to have a kind of sugarcoating of the fact that they as a party have got these problems. And it doesn't make a slight bit of difference. Who cares? Because if you're looking for someone that symbolises the kind of fight back that, for example, voting in 2016 to leave the EU represented, or if you're the kind of person who feels utterly in despair at the way that the 2019 Boris Tories sold you out, and that you maybe then hoped that this Labour government might at least make things a bit better, and now feel by both post-riots and every single other anti-working class measure that they've brought in, the latest, of course, being their attack on the farmers, then I think that you just go, I'm going with Reform, mate. Yeah. And there are other, say to viewers and listeners, there are other brands available. I mean, the SDP is getting its act together. But, as a serious challenger, I think they stand a chance of really breaking the mould.
No, absolutely. And I think it's because the kind of, as things currently stand, the longer term shifts favour them so obviously, because there is still this discontent which has been untapped. There is this pool of voters who might have voted for the Tory party for the first time in 2019 and feel very disillusioned and now moving back into that column. There's going to be a lot of Labour voters who either held their nose and voted for this government or didn't, or traditionally were Labour voters and haven't gone back into the fold. There is all kinds of opportunities here, and it has been really striking that whilst the kind of, as ever, you have the kind of internal disputes and discussions, the people feeling that the party's over if it doesn't do X, Y, Z. Similarly, you'll have the media continue to latch onto specific stories as a means to try and bash Farage, as has happened with this grim James McMurdoch story. Because of the fact that the facts on the ground haven't changed, people are still furious with the two main parties. They are looking for an outlet for genuine, small R reform for society. They want their interests to be put on the table, and those things haven't changed just because there's been a few Twitter storms or because Beth Rigby's had a go at Farage.
Exactly. And actually, significantly. The story always has been, and is one which I understand, which is to say, how can you break through first past the post. I mean, Parliament can't be representative. And of course, it's ridiculous that with over 4 million votes, they've only got 5 MPs. But the thing is, they did break through first past the post and got 5 MPs.
Yeah.
And they could get a lot more. And those MPs then, regardless of anything, actually, particularly Rupert Lowe and Richard Tice, are effective in the chamber, as they say. They're actually making quite a name for themselves. They've kind of mainstreamed and normalised the fact that they will stand up and ask questions about issues which nobody would dare. Rupert Lowe keeps saying, can we have the how many of the crimes committed were by illegal immigrants, right? And everyone goes, who brought him in here? Why was he allowed in the room? At the Spectator Parliamentary Awards, it was funny because Farage and Tice were there, and there was a lot more Labour MPs than usual because obviously they're in power, and it was Parliamentarian of the Year awards, and the Tories were there, and everyone was a bit like, Farage, and then it was like sort of, oh yeah, Parliamentarian of the Year, they're MPs, they are allowed to come, but therefore their visible presence in British politics is secured as MPs, ironically, regardless of whether they're good or bad MPs, they're actually vocal MPs, and that changes the mood as well.
Yeah,
it makes them seem it's feasible. They're not just on the outskirts all the time. So yeah, interesting times.
And I'm almost surprised that people are surprised by this turn of events, not least because, in the wake of the European elections, in which you were obviously elected with the Brexit Party, Claire, to the European Parliament, you looked at the Westminster polls after that, and there was a very similar kind of picture to what we're seeing now. There's a kind of almost a sort of three-way split between what was then Brexit, what is now Reform, the Tories and Labour, and then the rest of the percentages kind of shared amongst the rest. So it was quite clear that the 2019 election, the two-party system, at least on the basis of voting intention, is a bit different when you filter it through first past the post and so on, was really breaking down the kind of the truism that both Labour and the Tories could at least rely on about a third of the electorate was really starting to dip below that waterline. So it is really all prime for the taking, and Farage's the only one who's willing to do it.
Because the irony is that the political realignment, which is what we're talking about, because political realignment can take all sorts of form, as in America, where it's apparently taking the form of the Republican Party, but we all know it's not the Republican Party. It's the Trump version of the Republic, which is completely different. And of course, Boris Johnson could have had that in 2019 because the political realignment was expressed in his large majority in 2019, and he had those Brexit Party voters who had broken Red Wall, as to use the caricature, broken with the Labour Party, turned to Tories, believed in him, and they squandered it. Yeah, absolutely squandered it. But it never went away. The political realignment is absolutely guaranteed. It's just that we're looking now at what form it will take. And I think at the moment, that reform is reform. The Nick Candy thing, just to say, I think that is also significant because I know people who have told me from the Conservative Party that when his wife, Holly Valance, was thinking of standing, that Nick was a good Tory donor, and nothing will come of it. They're not saying that now. And I also think, by the way, it's significant about Suella Braverman's husband, because I also have spoken to Tories, before this all happened, who said, well, Suella's a bit sort of on the wild side, but her husband's brilliant. Great Tory campaigner. I was thinking they're not saying that now. He's defected over the weekend, and so you do think, and I, as you say, it's not a surprise. But what it does mean for that Conservative Party is panic. Yeah. And somebody actually on Newsnight pointed this out, which is rather unusually, one commentator pointed out that if the Labour Party aren't panicking, that's just because they're being complacent and in a bubble, and they need to. Because it's the Labour Party that's really going to suffer the outcome of this. We always talk about it like, oh, well, will it mean the Tories completely collapse? But I think it's the Labour Party wants to watch their backs.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.